Okay. This time we are going to be talking about positivist theorists. Reminder, sociological theories regarding deviance can generally be put into two theories, positivist and constructionist. The positivist theories tend to be more those that are favored by law enforcement, and the constructionist theorists tend to be more those who are sociologists or sociological researchers. So, those who favor positivism feel it is appealing because it strives for straightforward answers to why people behave in deviant ways. So the positivist wants to know why the person's doing this thing, right? And they don't want nuance. And as I mentioned, it tends to be more law enforcement oriented. Theories in this camp include strain theory, and there are multiple types of strain theory that I will discuss in this lecture. Social learning theory, and also control theory, and I will go over each of those in great detail. So, strain theory, also known as anomie strain theory, is tries to account for the breakdown of social norms, and it explains a lot of social behavior, especially in our world, our post-industrial world, our post-industrial cities, and even in the industrial world. So we in the United States are living in a post-industrial society. A lot of Mexico is post-industrial, but some of Mexico is industrial. All of that. This is our social world as it exists. And if you are remembering back to your Soc 101 classes, you will remember that Durkheim's suicide study uh, was really closely linked to this idea of anomie and the breakdown of social norms and the loneliness that that can cause. So, Durkheim identified the social force known as anomie when he was trying to understand who committed suicide or what caused suicide. Now, keep in mind, Durkheim was doing his research in Paris in the early 1900s. On those death certificates of those people, he had he had 3 points of information. I left one of them off this slide. He had sex, he had religion, and he had marital status. So, in terms of sex, he had whether the people were classified as male or female. In religion, he had people classified as Protestants, Catholics, or Jews. Keep in mind, this is France in the early 1900s, so they weren't very open minded. And he also had marital status. They were classified as being either single or married, namely because divorce was not legal in France during that time. And he found that men who were Protestants who were single were most likely to commit suicide. Overwhelmingly, he found this data. And he accounted for it based on this idea known as anomie, right? So men in that era were seen as being accountable to only themselves. Protestants in that era were were a very individualistic ideology of the time. The Protestantism of today, that type of Christian, is also still focused on community. During that era, community wasn't as important to that version of Christianity. And single people who are not as integrated into family life. And all of those components of these three factors that relate to whether you are connected to people or aren't connected to people. If you aren't connected to people, you have higher rates of anomie. And anomie, the sense of normlessness, the sense of lack of accountability, leads then to potentially committing suicide. That's what Durkheim found. Durkheim also found other factors leading to suicide. He determined that there are things called altruistic, egoistic, and fatalistic suicide, but we will talk more about those in great detail in our chapter on suicide itself. So if we apply this concept of anomie to deviance, we gain insight into the motivation of those people who are deviant. And this is where anomie strain theory comes from. So Merton, the guy that came up with anomie strain theory, who came after Durkheim, about 15 years after Durkheim's death, he wanted to look at the ways in which society encourages deviant behavior. So, and he observed that by setting unreasonable goals, but not providing everyone with the tools to achieve those goals, that creates strain, and that strain causes people to become deviant. So let's suss that out a little bit more. Merton observed that everyone in our society seeks to attain the same general goals. This is largely true, but to understand this theory, you need to make the assumption that everyone is trying to attain this same goal. I'll tell you the goal in a second. And to understand, to be able to use strain theory, you need to basically be studying people that are trying to attain that goal. That goal is making money. That goal is living a comfortable existence, living a comfortable life, having a house, a dog, 2 kids, and a spouse, right? And living comfortable, being able to go on vacation a couple times a year. That is the goal that Merton identifies in society, is financial comfort. And Merton identified that legitimate means to success are not freely available to everyone. A lot of people in our society are unable to attain that comfortable life, even though we expect all people in society to be able to attain that. And that creates a trap for people in the lower classes who want that goal but aren't able to get that goal. That creates strain. And the way that people deal with that strain can be described in the classifications Merton created to try to explain that. So, Merton continued by saying that by encouraging artificially high aspirations and denying avenues to success, society inadvertently creates deviance. By saying to people, you should be able to afford this car, you want this car on commercials, check out this awesome house, check out these places to go on vacation, but knowing you can't afford that, that creates strain in you. And Merton identified 5 ways that people can respond. The ways I lay it out in the following slides is pretty text oriented. There is a pretty handy table in your book, Table 2.1, that lays it out a little bit easier. If you find yourself struggling with this theory, it is very important. If you find yourself struggling, I can also provide other charts that might be more helpful, but what we have should be able to do the job. Just let me know if you're having trouble with this. So, the first way that Merton identified that people can be classified in the system of strain is conformity. If we accept both society's approved goals and the means to achieve those goals, we are classified as conformists. So, okay, you want money, you want a house, a dog, kids, whatever, you want that comfort, go get a job. And most people take this route, right? Most people try to do that thing. By virtue of you getting an education right now, you are falling into this, because while you're not necessarily making the money right now, you're trying to you're trying to do the thing that will get you money in the future. Most people in society are conformists. Now, innovation is another avenue that people can take. So, the use of illegitimate means to achieve socially accepted goals. And typically, people who are innovators do not live middle class lifestyles. It's a common misperception that drug dealers make a whole lot of money. Drug dealers do not, on average, make a whole lot of money. Surveys have been done. Pretty extensive sociological studies have been done studying drug dealers, and the reality of the fact is that a very active and successful drug dealer makes somewhere in the neighborhood of about $13 a working hour, which is kind of hard to believe. Like it's an okay wage, but it is not rolling in the money the way we perceive drug dealers to be. And drug dealers are the classic example of an innovator in Merton strain theory. This person wants the money, right? Wants the success, wants the comfort, but does not want to get a mainstream job, or is not capable of getting a mainstream job because, to begin with, he or she wasn't capable of going to college and getting that stuff. That wasn't available to those people. And innovation, things like drug dealing, things like sex work, those are alternate avenues that some people seek out. And oftentimes these are against the law. Now, it's important to note that a cupcake business, or opening your own business, or inventing new technology, from this perspective, that is not classified as innovation. That's still falling into conformity. Innovation really is, from this perspective, breaking the law to make money. Ritualism involves abandoning high success goals but pursuing legitimate work. So, working in fast food for 30 years, or working a low-level job for a long period of time. You are doing the work because you believe it's good to work, but you know you're never going to really make it or be comfortable doing this job, right? That is the ritualist classification. Retreatism is another route that people can make to dealing with strain. So the retreatist rejects the desire for comfort, and also rejects the means of achieving that comfort, right? Just basically rejects the system full out. Classic American example of a retreatist is the mountain man that goes off and lives on top of a mountain and just wants to be left alone. He has a big pile of guns and hunts his own food. That's a real classic American example. In India, there are many people who choose to they're called ascetics. They're called a bunch of different things. They choose to live a spiritual life as opposed to a materially comfortable life. These are two different avenues to the same thing. They reject comfort, and they reject those traditional means. That is classified as retreatist. The rebel is the fifth classification for enemy strain theory. Just like the retreatist, the rebel rejects that comfort and that material success, and they reject the means toward it, so they don't want to have a conventional job. But the rebel wants to overthrow the system. The rebel does reject means and reject goals, but they want to create new means and new goals. If you're familiar with him at all, Stokely Carmichael, the young man on the right, he was a real classic. He was a chief leader in the Black Power movement, and he was a critic of society as it existed. He was a great example of a rebel. Um, yeah. And here's that table 2.1. You can use that to try to understand enemy strain theory a little bit better. If you want further clarification on that, please let me know. Okay, so here we have a new set of concepts. We have Albert Cohen's status frustration theory. Cohen modified Merton's strain theory by introducing delinquent subculture driven by status frustration. He observed that lower class youth react to the desire for status as opposed to the desire for material comfort the way other people do, right? So, enemy strain theory is useful for understanding people who want money, but status frustration strain theory is more helpful to understand why these young people would turn to crime. Cloward and Owen then extended Merton's typology and theory by focusing on differential illegitimate opportunities. And they identified 3 different ways that subcultures can respond to the strains in society. One avenue that young people could turn to is to achieve goals by stealing, robbing, and reselling those goods, or what can be called fencing. I.e., young people can steal stuff to get stuff when they are frustrated. And this can be highly materialistic. So, when youth develop a criminal subculture, they can classify this as innovator type behavior, but if you want to understand, these are basically different words for the same thing. But so we can call that innovator, or from this set of theory, we call that a criminal subculture kind of thing. Or young people can develop into a conflict subculture, right? So, when young people form gangs, they do that to try to prove themselves, to try to prove their manliness, to try to prove that they are valuable to their community, even if that community is a gang, right? So this is an effort to try to get respect, maybe because the traditional routes for respect aren't available to you. Young people could also fall into a retreatist subculture, in which they use drug use as an identity, right? And we see this especially with marijuana use. You don't really see it with harder drugs, things like methamphetamine, things like heroin use. You don't typically see retreatist subcultures cropping up. A lot of it is with marijuana, maybe with some other hallucinogens such as mushrooms, maybe a couple other club drugs. The retreatist subculture, though, focuses on drug use and embracing that identity. Sometimes there are spiritual components tied into that as well. Now, in more modern sociological theory. Keep in mind, Merton developed a lot of his strain theory in the 1930s and 40s, and it is in need of a little bit of updating, especially because economic interest isn't everything. So when you're trying to understand criminals that are breaking the law because they for motivations other than money, or that can't be tied to money, strain theory isn't always useful. Um, so we in modern sociology, when we use strain theory, are trying to explore other areas of strain. So death of a loved one, trying to deal with serious illness, or trying to deal with relationship problems, trying to deal with child abuse, and either observing child abuse or the fact that maybe we ourselves were abused as children and neglect. These are other ways that we can try to understand that. Um, so we try to use things like status frustration theory, like that. And here is table 2.2. It tries to lay out, if you're a little bit, and this is confusing material, if you are trying to understand the difference between these three types of strain theory, you can look at that. So you see Merton's strain theory is the goal and the means creating deviance. Cohen's strain theory is the goal and the means creating status frustration, and then that status frustration creates deviance. And then you look at Cloward and Owen's version, where there's a goal, there's a means gap. This creates illegitimate opportunity and then deviant activity. If you have any question on those, please let me know. So that was strain theory. And our next lecture will talk about social learning theory. We're going to break down these into at least 2 lectures, maybe to give you an opportunity to pause this, take a break, maybe take a day break. Don't take more than a day break when watching this stuff, but you can come back to that later. And I will see you in the next lecture, maybe in a few minutes, maybe in a day or so. It depends on when you play it.